April 1945.
Bavaria. An American patrol hammered on the door of a farmhouse. What waited inside would land on the desk of one of the most terrifying commanders in the entire war within 60 minutes. A German family, a concealed space, and a man who had existed in total darkness for more than a year. When Patton received the report, he didn't dispatch a subordinate. He drove there personally. What he did upon arrival, that was not what anyone anticipated from the general with the ivory-handled revolvers, the volcanic speeches. The man whose entire reputation rested on seeing the world as geometry, angles of attack, lines of advance. What he did stunned every soldier in that farmhouse, and what followed would vanish quietly from official records for decades. To grasp what that farmhouse represented, you need to understand what April 1945 actually looked like at ground level. The war stood 3 weeks from its conclusion, but the conclusion was filthy. Not a single front folding inward. 1,000 simultaneous disintegrations. German units evaporating, roads choked with refugees, villages draping white linens before the Americans even appeared. And everywhere,
The physical evidence of what the Reich had been doing in those years before liberation arrived.
Patton had already walked through Ohrdruf. He had witnessed the interior of those camps. He had moved through proof of systematic, organized, industrialized savagery, and emerged on the other side, carrying something his diary entries from those weeks describe with an emotional clarity startling for a man who almost never committed feelings to paper directly. He wrote that language failed him. A man who had fought in 2 world wars, who had spent his entire career studying the worst atrocities human beings inflicted upon each other under the banner of conflict. And language failed him. 2 weeks after Ohrdruf, a patrol turned down a farm road outside a small Bavarian town. Everything Patton had been carrying since those camps suddenly acquired a different frame. Because what that patrol discovered was not evidence of what the Reich had done. It was evidence of what a small number of Germans had quietly refused to do. The farm was stone construction, low roof, a vegetable garden someone had recently turned for spring planting, indistinguishable from 1,000 other Bavarian homesteads. The patrol swept it as routine procedure. In the cellar, behind a shelf of preserved vegetables arranged with slightly too much precision against the far wall, they found a man. Thin, pale in the manner of someone who had not encountered direct sunlight in a very long time, wearing civilian clothes that did not belong to him, holding a small book. The soldiers needed a moment to process what they were seeing. Then, comprehension arrived. He had occupied that cellar for 14 months. His name was David Feldman, 43 years old, Jewish, and the German farm family living in the house above him, a farmer in his 50s, his wife, their 2 children, had been concealing him, feeding him, shielding him since February 1944. Under Nazi law, what that family had done carried a sentence of death. Not imprisonment, death. They had done it regardless. 14 months, through 2 winters, through the disintegration of the Reich around them, through the artillery growing louder with each passing week. The patrol sergeant radioed the situation up the chain. The report reached Patton, and Patton did something no one had written into his schedule that morning. His jeep appeared on the farm road 40 minutes after that radio call. He arrived with his aide and 2 military police officers. No formal escort, no ceremony. The Hoffman family, Georg the farmer, his wife Margarita, their children, stood in the main room when Patton entered. David Feldman had been brought up from the cellar. He sat in a chair near the window, blinking at April light with the careful slowness of someone whose eyes had spent months adjusting to darkness and had not yet fully remembered what brightness was. Patton filled the doorway and surveyed the room. His gaze rested on Feldman for a long moment, then shifted to the family. What happened next made the American soldiers in that room glance at one another. He dragged a chair across the kitchen floor, positioned it beside Feldman's, and sat down. Not to conduct a formal interrogation, not to assess the tactical situation and bark orders. He sat beside the man the way you sit when you want someone to know there is no clock running, that what they carry deserves stillness. Through his aide, who spoke German, he asked the simplest questions first. "What is your name? Where are you from?" Then Patton asked about his family, and the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. Feldman's wife had been taken in 1943. His children before that. He did not know where they were sent. He said he had spent 14 months in that cellar without knowing. He said this without drama, in the flat, measured voice of a man who has repeated the facts so often they can no longer crack his speech, even though they have not stopped cracking everything else. Patton was silent for a long moment. Then he said something no one in that room anticipated. He said, quote, _0, quote, _. The aide translated. Feldman looked at Patton, not with hope, not with the sudden flood of a man hearing what he desperately needed, with something far more layered. The look of a man who had learned across 14 months underground not to trust kindness offered as something to grip. He held Patton's gaze anyway. Patton did not break it. Then he rose and turned toward the Hoffman family. And here is where the story shifts in a direction nobody inside that farmhouse saw coming. The American soldiers present were waiting for orders. They understood what procedure demanded. Feldman needed documentation. Transfer to the nearest displaced persons facility. Processing through the administrative machinery the army was constructing for exactly these cases. The Hoffman family needed assessment. Their cooperation with the occupation recorded. Their wartime conduct noted. Standard protocol. Patton issued those orders. He told his aide what Feldman required. He arranged transport. He ensured the medical evaluation was scheduled. But before any of it moved forward, he did something the soldiers present later described as the moment the air in that room shifted completely. He turned to George Hoffman and through his aide said this. "I want you to understand something. What you did, what your family did, required a kind of courage I have never demanded of any soldier under my command." He paused. "I have sent men into artillery barrages. I have ordered men across defended rivers. I have asked men to accomplish things that seemed beyond possibility and watched them succeed. What I have never ordered, what cannot be ordered, is what you chose to do every single morning for 14 months. That kind of courage cannot be commanded. You either possess it or you do not." He looked at Marguerite. He looked at the children. "You possessed it, every one of you, and I want you to know that I understand what it cost." The Hoffman family said nothing. Marguerite's hands were folded in her lap. Georg stared at the floor. The children watched Patton with that wide, locked attention of young people who sense something enormous happening without fully grasping its shape. Then Patton said one final thing. He walked out, got in his jeep, drove back to headquarters, and then, quietly, something began happening to the record of that morning. Something that took decades to fully surface. The official Third Army report for April 1945 covers the advance through Bavaria in extensive operational detail. Unit positions, road conditions, enemy contacts. The logistics of pushing a massive force through terrain being simultaneously liberated and reorganized. The farmhouse on the road outside the Bavarian town appears briefly. A patrol contact. A displaced civilian recovered. A German family cooperative with occupation forces. The civilian transferred to appropriate facilities. That is all. No names, no mention of Patton's presence at the scene, no record of what he said to the Hoffman family. No documentation of his instruction that the family be treated as allies and recorded by name. Military historians who combed through Third Army records during the 1970s and 1980s, working on larger projects about the liberation of Jewish survivors and the role of non-Jewish rescuers across occupied Europe, noticed the gap. The incident left enough of a paper trail to be found, but the paper trail ended precisely where the meaningful details should have begun. This was not an isolated case. Across Third Army documentation from those final weeks of the war, the same pattern repeats. Events captured at the operational level, stripped of the human texture that witness testimony and personal letters confirm actually existed. Some of this is simply how armies keep records. They log what is militarily relevant. A general's conversation in a farmhouse kitchen does not qualify, by any narrow definition, as militarily relevant. But certain researchers began detecting something beyond standard bureaucratic omission, something that made the absence feel less like routine and more like deliberate editorial choice. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult, and this is where honest history demands saying what most retellings of this incident quietly omit. George Patton, who pulled a chair beside David Feldman in that kitchen and promised they would search for his family, also wrote things in his private diary over the months that followed. Things that are deeply, authentically disturbing. Through the summer and autumn of 1945, as the displaced persons crisis unfolded, hundreds of thousands of Jewish Holocaust survivors housed in temporary facilities across occupied Germany, Patton recorded his views in language that historians have classified as anti-Semitic. Those entries do not improve with additional context or the passage of time. They exist in the record. They are documented. They belong to who Patton was. He was eventually removed from command of the Third Army, in part because his management of the displaced persons situation, including active resistance to improving conditions at survivor facilities, violated Army policy and violated basic human decency. This is the same man who sat with Feldman, the same man who told the Hoffman family their bravery surpassed anything he could command, the same man who emerged from Ordruf unable to articulate what his eyes had absorbed, and the same man whose diary, months later, employed language belonging to the very ideology that built those camps. Both realities are true, simultaneously, within a single person. This is the portion of the story that refuses clean resolution, that cannot be wielded to render Patton purely heroic or purely monstrous, that demands holding two verified truths at once and refusing to let either erase the other. The farmhouse happened, the diary entries happened. The question of how one man contains both, how the same individual can recognize singular human dignity with such clarity, then fail it so catastrophically in the aggregate, carries no comfortable answer. It may be the most vital question the farmhouse forces us to ask. The Army's tracing services received David Feldman's family names. The search consumed 3 months. His wife had not survived. His daughter had not survived. His son, 12 years old when the family was torn apart, had survived. British forces had found him at Bergen-Belsen during the camp's liberation in April 1945. He was recovering in a hospital within the British zone. Father and son were brought together again in the summer of 1945. Feldman wrote a letter to Margareta Hoffman in 1948. He composed it from Israel, where he had emigrated. He had spent time searching for the family that saved his life, eventually locating an address through contacts in the German Red Cross. The letter described the reunion with his son. It described constructing a new existence in a country unfamiliar to him, a country that was also, in a way he called difficult to articulate, the only place that made sense. Then he wrote about the farmhouse, about that April morning when the Americans arrived, about the general who dragged a chair across the kitchen floor and sat